On February 14, 2016, a man was found dead under mysterious circumstances in a luxury hotel room in Beirut. That man was Nasir Maktoom, a senior Hezbollah commander, whose sudden death would unravel a story of espionage, deception, and international intrigue. The body lay neatly arranged on crisp white sheets, the room undisturbed, the door locked from the inside. Hotel staff initially suspected a medical emergency, until subtle inconsistencies emerged, suggesting that something far darker had occurred within those silent walls. Security cameras showed nothing unusual, no struggle, no forced entry, no hurried exit. Maktoom had arrived alone the previous evening, checking in under his real name, confident in secrecy, unaware that unseen eyes were already mapping his final hours. Outside, Beirut moved as it always did, traffic humming, cafes alive with conversation. Inside that hotel room, however, time had stopped. The discovery sent quiet shockwaves through intelligence circles long before the public learned his name. Within hours, whispers spread among security services. This was not a random death. It carried the unmistakable signature of professional planning, surgical precision, and a message written not in words, but in silence and plausible deniability. As the sun rose over the Mediterranean, officials sealed the floor, phones rang across borders, and a single question surfaced repeatedly in closed rooms. Who could reach a man like Maktoom without leaving a trace behind? Nasir Maktoom was not merely a regional commander. He was a logistical architect, a man whose decisions moved weapons, money, and influence across invisible lines. His death threatened to destabilize carefully balanced operations throughout the Middle East. For Hezbollah, the loss risked internal confusion and exposed vulnerabilities. For Israel, it represented a potential strategic shift. For global intelligence agencies, it was a reminder that shadow wars never truly end, they simply change shape. The location mattered. Beirut was a city saturated with surveillance, rival services, and overlapping loyalties. Executing a silent operation there required intimate knowledge, flawless timing, and confidence that political consequences could be contained afterward. International analysts understood the implications immediately. If this was an assassination, it signaled escalation. If it was natural, it exposed complacency. Either explanation carried risks that extended far beyond a single hotel room. Behind diplomatic statements and cautious headlines, governments recalculated. Alliances were tested quietly, red lines blurred. The death of one man threatened to ignite reactions that no public briefing would ever fully acknowledge. In intelligence headquarters across continents, Maktoom file folders were reopened. Past operations were re-examined. Patterns resurfaced. The stakes were no longer personal. They were systemic, strategic, and dangerously unresolved. Who was behind the death of a man so deeply embedded in secrecy and protection? Why did it happen on that specific night, in that specific room, under conditions designed to erase human fingerprints? Was this an act of vengeance, prevention, or calculated deterrence? Did Maktoom know he was being watched? Or did confidence blind him to an approaching threat disguised as chance and routine? Why leave no trace of violence, no chemical residue easily detected, no witness able to speak? What message was sent by making death appear ordinary, almost merciful, within an extraordinary conflict? And perhaps most unsettling, how many others had already been marked, followed through airports, elevators, and lobbies, unaware that their stories were nearing similar conclusions? Because in the hidden war of intelligence, answers rarely arrive with certainty. They surface slowly, fragmented, and often too late to change what has already been set in motion. Nasir Maktoom was born in southern Lebanon during the final years of civil war, into a family shaped by displacement, loss, and sectarian memory. His childhood unfolded amid ruins, checkpoints, and whispered stories of resistance passed down like inheritance. His father was a logistics clerk with quiet sympathies for militant networks, while his mother emphasized discipline and religious duty. Together they cultivated caution, secrecy, and obedience, traits that would later define Nasir's adult persona and operational instincts. Growing up near the Israeli border, Maktoom learned early how geography dictates destiny. Distant artillery fire and periodic incursions normalized danger, embedding a worldview where survival required alignment, loyalty, and preparation rather than neutrality or hesitation. Teachers described him as observant, rarely disruptive, but intensely focused. He excelled in memorization and pattern recognition, often studying people more than books. Classmates recalled his silence as deliberate, a habit of listening rather than revealing intention. At home, political discussions were ritualized. Names of martyrs were spoken with reverence, while enemies were described abstractly, almost academically. This framing removed moral ambiguity, simplifying violence into necessity rather than choice or consequence. Economic hardship further narrowed his options. University aspirations faded quickly, replaced by local employment and informal networks. These environments rewarded discretion and reliability, qualities Maktoum demonstrated consistently, drawing attention from figures operating just beyond legality. By adolescence, he had learned how to move unnoticed, how to remember faces, and how to compartmentalize emotion. These were survival skills in his neighborhood, but also foundational tools for a life increasingly intertwined with clandestine activity. Family elders encouraged patience, reminding him that power came slowly. He absorbed this lesson deeply, believing that true influence required invisibility. Loud men died young. Quiet men, they insisted, endured, and eventually shaped outcomes from behind curtains. Religious education reinforced discipline. Maktoum attended evening lessons emphasizing obedience, sacrifice, and collective duty. The language was moral, but the implications were practical, reinforcing hierarchies and justifying future actions in service of something larger than self. By the time he reached adulthood, Nasir Maktoum was already formed by conflict. His upbringing did not radicalize suddenly. It normalized confrontation, conditioned restraint, and prepared him psychologically for a path where secrecy became both shield and weapon. Maktoum's ideology was pragmatic rather than theatrical. He believed resistance was administrative as much as violent, requiring logistics, patience, and infrastructure. Ideology served as justification, but efficiency was his true obsession, guiding decisions with cold calculation. He avoided grand speeches and rarely invoked religious rhetoric publicly. Privately, however, he framed actions through destiny and obligation, convincing himself that personal discomfort was irrelevant within a broader historical struggle, requiring constant vigilance and sacrifice. Colleagues noted his aversion to excess. He drank only tea, avoided luxury, and kept possessions minimal. This austerity reinforced operational discipline, reducing vulnerabilities while projecting an image of incorruptibility that earned trust within hierarchical structures. Maktoum kept meticulous handwritten notes, never digital, encoded through personal shorthand. These notebooks traveled with him everywhere, treated as extensions of memory. He believed machines betrayed users eventually, while paper demanded deliberate destruction. Despite his severity, he displayed peculiar habits. He listened repeatedly to the same classical Arabic songs, claiming repetition sharpened focus. He also walked precisely measured distances each morning, treating routine as mental armor against chaos. Trust came slowly. Maktoum tested associates through silence, delays, and misinformation. Those who endured gained access gradually. This method reduced infiltration risks, but fostered isolation, reinforcing his belief that leadership required emotional distance. He slept lightly, often waking before dawn, convinced vulnerability increased during rest. This hypervigilance, admired by superiors, quietly eroded personal relationships, further anchoring his identity exclusively within the cause he served relentlessly. Within internal communications, Maktoum was known as the Quartermaster, a title reflecting his control over supply chains rather than battlefield heroics. He accepted it without protest, viewing anonymity as protection rather than insult or diminished status. Younger operatives called him Uncle Nasir, a term blending respect and distance. He discouraged familiarity, yet allowed the name because it reinforced hierarchy while maintaining approachability necessary for command efficiency and internal loyalty. He rejected honorifics associated with martyrdom. Death, he argued, was an outcome, not an objective. This perspective set him apart from more charismatic figures, positioning him as a stabilizer rather than a symbol. Maktoum viewed himself as temporary. He believed individuals were interchangeable instruments within enduring movements. This self-image reduced fear, but also justified ruthless decisions, since personal survival carried meaning only insofar as it advanced collective objectives. Stories circulated of him declining promotions that increased visibility. Whether true or cultivated, these anecdotes reinforced his reputation as a man uninterested in glory, content operating beneath attention thresholds where real power quietly accumulated. Maktoum's entry into militancy was incremental, disguised as community service and logistical assistance. He transported supplies, coordinated housing, and managed communications, tasks that appeared benign but formed essential arteries supporting larger operational frameworks. The transition accelerated following a border skirmish that killed a distant cousin. Though not emotionally close, Maktoum interpreted the events symbolically, reinforcing narratives of perpetual threat and legitimizing deeper involvement beyond auxiliary support roles. He was recruited formally in his late 20s after years of informal cooperation. The offer came without ceremony, presented as responsibility rather than honor. Acceptance was expected, and refusal would have implied ideological unreliability. Training emphasized counterintelligence awareness, document handling, and compartmentalization. Maktoum excelled, particularly in operational planning. Instructors noted his ability to anticipate secondary consequences, a skill that elevated him rapidly within administrative ranks. Political engagement followed naturally. He acted as liaison between militant units and sympathetic political figures, translating violence into negotiation leverage. This dual exposure expanded his influence, embedding him deeper into organizational strategy and long-term planning. Unlike frontline commanders, Maktoum rarely appeared publicly. His power grew through absence, shaping outcomes indirectly. This invisibility shielded him from attention while increasing reliance on his judgment across multiple operational theaters. By the time international intelligence agencies registered his name, Nasir Maktoum was no longer merely a participant. He had become an indispensable node, quietly binding logistics, politics, and militancy into a single, resilient structure. The conflicts surrounding Nasir Maktoum existed long before his birth, rooted in unresolved wars, occupation, and shifting regional power balances. Southern Lebanon became a persistent frontline where ideology, geography, and foreign intervention collided repeatedly over decades. Israel's 1982 invasion of Lebanon reshaped the region permanently, creating conditions that enabled armed resistance movements to consolidate legitimacy. That intervention fractured Lebanese sovereignty while embedding external actors deeply into local political and military structures. From this chaos emerged Hezbollah, blending religious ideology with disciplined military organization. It positioned itself as defender against occupation, while simultaneously evolving into a transnational actor with ambitions extending beyond Lebanese borders. The Lebanese civil war normalized militia authority, weakening centralized governance. In its aftermath, armed groups retained weapons, influence, and autonomy, creating a hybrid state where political parties and militant wings coexisted uneasily within formal institutions. Sectarian divides hardened during these years. Shia communities, historically marginalized, found representation and empowerment through Hezbollah's structure. This social contract fused identity with resistance, making disarmament politically impossible without existential compromise. Border skirmishes between Israel and Hezbollah became cyclical. Each exchange reinforced narratives of deterrence and retaliation, locking both sides into an escalatory logic where restraint appeared as weakness rather than strategic patience. The 2006 war intensified these dynamics. Though militarily inconclusive, it elevated Hezbollah's regional profile. While convincing Israeli planners that indirect confrontation had failed to neutralize long-term threats embedded within civilian environments. From that moment, intelligence operations gained primacy. Assassinations, cyber intrusions, and covert surveillance replaced large-scale invasions. The battlefield shifted inward into hotels, apartments, and financial networks where visibility equaled vulnerability. Maktoum's career unfolded precisely within this evolution. He was a product of a conflict transitioning from conventional warfare toward shadow operations designed to manage risk while avoiding overt escalation. The broader conflict, therefore, was not static. It adapted continuously, absorbing lessons from each failure, refining tactics, and expanding theaters from borders into cities, airports, and diplomatic corridors. Lebanon officially balanced neutrality with internal fragmentation. Its government condemned foreign assassinations publicly, while privately constrained by the reality that Hezbollah functioned as both political actor and armed power beyond state control. Israel viewed Hezbollah as an existential threat, not merely a neighboring militia. Its strategic doctrine prioritized preemption, intelligence superiority, and targeted eliminations over territorial occupation following costly past engagements. Iran emerged as Hezbollah's primary patron, providing funding, training, and strategic direction. Through this alliance, Tehran projected influence westward, transforming Lebanese territory into a forward deterrence platform against Israeli and Western pressure. Syria functioned historically as a logistical corridor, enabling weapons transfers and personnel movement. Though weakened by civil war, its territory remained critical, complicating intelligence efforts and creating overlapping jurisdictions hostile to transparency. The United States designated Hezbollah a terrorist organization, aligning diplomatically with Israel while balancing Lebanese stability concerns. This duality produced selective pressure rather than comprehensive confrontation, leaving operational spaces deliberately ambiguous. European states maintained fragmented positions. Some distinguished between Hezbollah's political and military wings, allowing diplomatic engagement while condemning violence. This inconsistency created exploitable gaps in travel, finance, and surveillance. Russia monitored developments cautiously, prioritizing regional stability over ideological alignment. Its involvement in Syria introduced additional layers of coordination and constraint, forcing intelligence actors to recalibrate risk thresholds constantly. Within this mosaic, Beirut became a convergence point. Diplomats, operatives, financiers, and militants crossed paths daily, creating an environment where covert action required precision to avoid cascading international consequences. Maktoum operated within these contradictions. His movements exploited jurisdictional seams, political hesitations, and the reluctance of states to escalate publicly, despite active clandestine conflict beneath formal diplomacy. Thus, every country's position mattered. Each restraint or endorsement shaped the operational calculus that ultimately rendered certain individuals vulnerable despite layers of protection. Nasir Maktoom mattered because he was connective tissue. He linked financiers to fighters, politicians to smugglers, ideology to execution. Removing him risked disrupting multiple networks simultaneously, rather than eliminating a single commander. He managed procurement routes critical for sustaining deterrence. Missiles, electronics, and funds flowed through channels he supervised personally, minimizing exposure while maximizing reliability across hostile intelligence environments. Maktoum also understood timing. He coordinated deliveries around diplomatic events, elections, and military exercises, exploiting predictable pauses in surveillance intensity. This temporal awareness made his role uniquely valuable. Unlike charismatic leaders, he did not inspire loyalty through speeches. He enforced it through consistency. Units trusted that supplies would arrive, payments would clear, and contingencies would be addressed quietly. For adversaries, this made him dangerous. Killing symbolic figures generated headlines but limited disruption. Eliminating logisticians created operational paralysis, forcing reactive decisions and exposing secondary actors to detection. Intelligence assessments classified Maktoum as low visibility, high impact. His absence from media reduced political fallout if targeted, while his death promised tangible degradation of operational capacity. He also possessed institutional memory. Decades of trial, error, and adaptation resided within his routines. Replacing such knowledge required time, mentorship, and stability rarely afforded under constant surveillance pressure. Maktoum's importance, therefore, was structural, not ideological. He represented continuity within a movement accustomed to martyrdom, but dependent on administrators to function between moments of spectacle. By existing outside public myth-making, he avoided scrutiny until patterns emerged too clearly to ignore. Once identified, his very discretion marked him for removal within the logic of intelligence warfare. In this context, his death was not personal, it was strategic. A calculated incision designed to weaken an organism without provoking immediate systemic collapse or uncontrollable retaliation. Maktoum's earliest recorded offenses were logistical violations rather than acts of violence. He facilitated unauthorized transport, forged customs documentation, and coordinated discrete storage sites. These activities drew minimal attention, blending into Lebanon's informal economy where legality and survival often overlapped. His first arrest occurred in the late 1990s during a routine checkpoint inspection. Authorities detained him briefly for document inconsistencies. No weapons were found. He was released within days, an experience that taught him both procedural weaknesses and the value of bureaucratic patience. Rather than deter him, detention validated his assumptions. Maktoum adjusted methods, layered intermediaries, and reduced personal exposure. He learned that systems collapse not through force but through quiet exploitation of complacency, corruption, and overworked institutions. Subsequent encounters with law enforcement remained peripheral. He was questioned, never charged, and increasingly invisible. Each interaction sharpened his understanding of thresholds, teaching him precisely how far activity could escalate without triggering decisive intervention. These early transgressions established his reputation internally. He was reliable under pressure, discreet during scrutiny, and capable of learning from mistakes without emotional reaction. Senior figures began entrusting him with larger responsibilities quietly. Though Maktoom avoided long imprisonment, several associates alleged he endured harsh interrogation during a brief detainment in the early 2000s. Details remained intentionally vague, contributing to myth rather than verifiable record within internal narratives. Maktoom himself never confirmed these accounts. He referenced the experience obliquely, describing it as clarifying rather than traumatizing. Whether exaggerated or accurate, the story reinforced loyalty, portraying endurance as proof of ideological sincerity. Psychologically, the episode hardened his worldview. He concluded that mercy was temporary, conditional, and strategic. This belief justified future decisions prioritizing security over empathy, reinforcing emotional distance already cultivated through years of clandestine involvement. Within organizational culture, such experiences functioned symbolically. They framed commitment as tested through suffering, transforming detention into credential. Maktoom neither encouraged nor denied these interpretations, allowing ambiguity to enhance authority without explicit endorsement. Maktoom's formal integration into higher organizational tiers followed this period. He did not found new factions but reshaped existing units by consolidating logistics under centralized oversight, reducing redundancy and improving operational resilience against disruption. He recruited specialists rather than ideologues, valuing competence over rhetoric. Engineers, accountants, and transport coordinators replaced volunteers motivated primarily by belief. This shift professionalized operations, aligning them closer to institutional continuity than spontaneous militancy. Maktoom also established compartmentalized cells. Members knew functions, not hierarchies. This design limited damage from arrests or defections, frustrating intelligence efforts attempting to map networks comprehensively. His influence expanded laterally rather than vertically. Instead of commanding fighters directly, he controlled resources they depended upon. This indirect authority minimized exposure while maximizing leverage across disparate operational theaters. By the mid-2000s, Maktoom had become indispensable. Groups adjusted planning cycles around his availability, acknowledging implicitly that operations succeeded or failed based on logistical coherence he quietly enforced. As regional tensions intensified, Maktoom's portfolio expanded. Smuggling routes diversified, incorporating maritime channels and overland corridors. Each adjustment responded to surveillance patterns rather than ideological escalation, reflecting adaptive pragmatism over impulsive aggression. Though not a field commander, Maktoom authorized operations indirectly linked to kidnappings and targeted killings. His role remained administrative, yet responsibility followed function. Decisions on timing and support enabled violence without requiring physical proximity. This distance insulated him psychologically. He framed outcomes as consequences of strategy rather than personal choice. Such compartmentalization allowed continued efficiency while dulling moral friction that might otherwise compromise judgment. Intelligence intercepts later suggested Maktoom approved actions selectively, preferring deterrent effect over spectacle. Excessive violence invited scrutiny. Controlled escalation maintained pressure while preserving operational sustainability. Through this phase, his reputation shifted externally. Adversaries no longer viewed him as peripheral. Analysts began identifying patterns converging around his coordination, elevating him gradually within threat assessments. Between 2008 and 2014, several incidents traced indirectly to Maktoom demonstrated escalating sophistication. Supply interdictions failed repeatedly, suggesting anticipatory rerouting timed precisely around known surveillance gaps and diplomatic distractions. One intercepted shipment revealed false provenance documents prepared months earlier, indicating long-horizon planning. Another operation collapsed after authorities raided an empty warehouse hours too late, its contents already redistributed seamlessly. Communications analysis showed brief, infrequent contact windows, minimizing traceability. Maktoom appeared rarely, but when he did, outcomes followed predictably. His involvement correlated with success, absence with failure. These incidents built a cumulative profile. Analysts mapped logistics nodes converging statistically toward his oversight. The evidence was circumstantial, but patterns persisted, compelling intelligence agencies to elevate his priority incrementally. By the time his name entered most wanted databases, escalation had already peaked. Maktoom had reached maximum effectiveness, and within intelligence logic, maximum vulnerability. By 2012, Nasir Maktoom's name began appearing consistently in classified assessments circulated among Western and regional intelligence services. His profile shifted from logistical facilitator to strategic enabler, a designation that placed him within lethal targeting frameworks rather than passive monitoring lists. Signals intelligence suggested his coordination intersected with multiple threat vectors simultaneously. Analysts noted that removing him could disrupt supply continuity without triggering immediate retaliation, a rare alignment of tactical opportunity and political plausibility. Within Israeli intelligence circles, Maktoom's file expanded rapidly. Cross-referencing travel data, financial flows, and intercepted communications revealed a pattern of disciplined movement and minimal digital footprint, hallmarks of a seasoned clandestine operator. Mossad analysts categorized him as low exposure but high yield. Unlike public leaders, his absence would create confusion internally while remaining deniable externally, an optimal profile for covert action. By 2014, allied services quietly shared intelligence regarding his movements. Red notices were considered but never issued, reflecting political sensitivities surrounding Lebanon's internal balance and the risks of overt escalation. Instead, Maktoom was elevated onto informal watch lists. His travel triggered alerts. His associates were flagged. Slowly, invisibly, the perimeter around him tightened as surveillance replaced speculation. Within Hezbollah, security protocols adjusted subtly. Maktoom rotated locations frequently, avoided patterns, and reduced travel. These changes confirmed adversarial suspicions. He knew attention was growing, even if its source remained unspoken. At this stage, Maktoom was no longer merely operating within conflict. He had become part of its strategic calculus, a variable whose removal was actively modeled across intelligence simulations. The first suspected attempt occurred in 2013, when a vehicle malfunction narrowly avoided catastrophe during a mountain transit. No explosives were found, but forensic anomalies raised suspicion internally without definitive attribution. A second incident followed months later, involving contaminated medication delivered through an intermediary. Maktoom avoided harm due to delayed consumption. The source was never identified, reinforcing paranoia and validating existing security fears. Drone surveillance near a safe house in southern Beirut triggered relocation orders in 2015. Though no strike occurred, the exposure suggested adversaries were testing response times rather than executing prematurely. Each failed or aborted attempt served dual purpose. It applied pressure while collecting behavioral data. How Maktoom reacted, moved, and adapted revealed layers of his security apparatus incrementally. Rather than retreat, he doubled down on counter-surveillance. He reduced his circle further, trusted fewer handlers, and relied increasingly on routine to mask decision points. These adaptations delayed action but also narrowed margins. Within Mossad planning cells, patience prevailed. Analysts concluded that forcing opportunity increased risk. Instead, they waited for convergence, a moment where routine, isolation, and jurisdiction aligned favorably. That moment would not come through aggression. It would arrive quietly, through predictability disguised as caution. By early 2016, Maktoom's movements stabilized. He selected familiar environments, believing familiarity reduced risk. This decision, intended as protection, marked the final miscalculation within a career defined by precision. Beirut hotels offered anonymity, layered access, and plausible deniability. For Maktoom, they represented neutrality. For his pursuers, they represented controlled environments where variables could be isolated. Intelligence briefings shifted tone. Language moved from conditional to preparatory. The question was no longer if Maktoom could be reached, but when exposure would be optimal and consequences containable. In clandestine warfare, inevitability rarely announces itself. It accumulates quietly, disguised as routine, until choice collapses into execution. For Nasir Maktoom, that convergence was already underway, unseen, methodical, and irreversible. In early February 2016, a series of unrelated travelers arrived in Beirut through separate flights, spaced carefully across days and airlines. Their passports reflected different nationalities, professions, and purposes, forming a pattern visible only in retrospect. Each operative traveled alone, carrying minimal luggage and rehearsed backstories. They passed through immigration without incident, leaving no reason for secondary screening. Individually, they were forgettable. Collectively, they formed a converging geometry of intent. Hotel reservations were made indirectly, through third-party platforms, with overlapping but unremarkable timeframes. No single booking raised suspicion. The city, accustomed to transient populations, absorbed their presence without friction or memory. None arrived together. None acknowledged one another publicly. Beirut, dense with visitors and intelligence watchers alike, provided cover through saturation. Anonymity emerged not from isolation but from blending perfectly into expectation. Nasir Maktoom checked into the hotel 2 nights later, selecting a mid-level room with controlled access and internal corridors. He chose the location for familiarity, having stayed there previously without incident or perceived compromise. Surveillance began before his arrival. Operatives rotated observation positions discreetly, never lingering. Elevators, lobbies, and cafes were mapped through routine movement rather than fixed posts. Avoiding behavioral signatures that cameras might later highlight, Maktoom's habits were logged silently. Meal timing, exits, returns, elevator preference, and interaction patterns formed a behavioral profile updated in real time. No direct contact was required. Distance preserved invisibility. Hotel staff remained unaware. Requests were ordinary. No bribes, no intimidation, no interference. The environment was allowed to function normally, reducing risk by preserving routine rather than disrupting it. By the second evening, surveillance confirmed isolation. Maktoom met no associates. He conducted no meetings. His confidence appeared intact, reinforced by uneventful repetition of familiar rhythms. The day began without deviation. Maktoom left his room mid-morning, returned briefly, then departed again. Each movement aligned with previous patterns, reinforcing assessments that he perceived no immediate threat. Operatives adjusted positions incrementally, synchronizing presence with his absence. Timing mattered more than speed. Precision relied on patience rather than momentum, ensuring windows aligned without forcing action prematurely. Afternoon passed uneventfully. Environmental variables remained stable. No unexpected visitors appeared. No security alterations occurred. Conditions converged slowly toward execution criteria defined long before arrival. As evening approached, Maktoom returned to his room for the final time. He ordered food, declined housekeeping, and activated privacy indicators. These choices meant to secure solitude, finalized isolation parameters. From that moment, contingencies narrowed. Decision trees collapsed into a single path. There would be no second opportunity without escalating risk beyond acceptable thresholds. The method selected avoided visible trauma. It relied on inducing physiological failure indistinguishable initially from natural causes. This approach minimized forensic clarity while preserving plausible deniability across diplomatic and legal domains. No weapons were carried openly. Tools fit within everyday objects, chosen for accessibility and disposability. Electronics were limited, used briefly, then discarded to prevent traceable emissions or recoverable data. Entry and exit protocols prioritized reversibility. Locks were manipulated non-destructively. Environmental disruption was minimized. The room would appear unchanged, reinforcing assumptions of sudden medical collapse. Communication among operatives was silent during execution windows. Prearranged timing replaced live coordination, reducing interception risk. Human error was mitigated through redundancy embedded during planning rather than reaction. Everything used was intended to vanish into normalcy. Nothing lingered to tell a story. There were moments of risk. An elevator stopped unexpectedly. A hallway door opened briefly. Footsteps approached, then faded. Each incident tested discipline, requiring stillness rather than improvisation. Heart rates elevated, but movements did not. Training emphasized restraint over reflex. The absence of action became the action, preserving invisibility through deliberate inaction when instinct urged response. Time stretched. Seconds felt elastic. Surveillance confirmed no deviation. The environment remained neutral. Suspense resolved not through confrontation, but through continuation of silence. When the final window closed, there was no celebration, no acknowledgement. The operation transitioned immediately into disengagement, treating success as procedural completion rather than emotional milestone. Nasir Maktoom died alone in his hotel room, seated where he had rested countless times before. There were no signs of struggle. His expression suggested sudden confusion rather than fear or anticipation. His body was positioned carefully, reinforcing the appearance of collapse. The scene communicated nothing extraordinary. It invited assumptions rather than questions, delaying scrutiny through familiarity. Within minutes, the room was empty again. Operatives dispersed independently, retracing nothing, acknowledging no one. Beirut absorbed them as it had welcomed them, without recognition or resistance. Maktoom's death registered initially as unremarkable. That was the point. In covert warfare, success is measured by silence, by delay, by the time it takes before anyone realizes history has shifted quietly. The body was discovered the following morning by housekeeping staff after repeated unanswered knocks. Inside the quiet room, Nasir Maktoom sat motionless, surroundings undisturbed, suggesting sudden illness rather than violence, an assumption that initially delayed urgency and scrutiny. Hotel management contacted local authorities, reporting an apparent natural death. In a city accustomed to quiet tragedies, the response was procedural. Only subtle inconsistencies, posture, timing, and absence of distress signals unsettled experienced responders arriving on scene. Within hours, whispers spread through security channels in Beirut. The name carried weight. What appeared ordinary began attracting attention disproportionate to visible evidence, signaling that this death belonged to another category entirely. The autopsy produced ambiguity rather than clarity. No external injuries were present. Organs showed signs of acute failure, yet lacked pathology consistent with known chronic conditions. Toxicology screens returned inconclusive, deepening suspicion without providing confirmation. Medical examiners noted anomalies suggestive of induced collapse, but without definitive markers. The cause of death remained officially undetermined, a classification that satisfied paperwork while frustrating investigators aware that absence of proof did not equal absence of action. This uncertainty proved useful to some and infuriating to others. It allowed competing narratives to coexist, buying time for those responsible and limiting immediate escalation by denying irrefutable forensic attribution. Attention shifted to surveillance footage. Investigators reconstructed timelines, identifying individuals whose movements aligned too precisely with Maktoom's schedule. Separately innocuous, collectively suspicious, these figures appeared and vanished without obvious connection. Passport records soon complicated matters further. Several visitors entered Lebanon using documents later flagged by foreign governments as fraudulent or cloned, triggering diplomatic concern once patterns became publicly undeniable. Footage leaked selectively, faces blurred, narratives hardened. What began as a quiet death evolved into an intelligence scandal, exposing vulnerabilities in international travel systems and revealing how easily identities could be manufactured, deployed, and erased. Governments issued denials calibrated carefully. Allies expressed concern without accusation. Diplomatic expulsions followed quietly, framed as unrelated administrative actions while signaling displeasure without confirming responsibility. Media speculation intensified. Intelligence officials refused comment. Each silence spoke louder than statements, reinforcing perceptions of state involvement while preserving plausible deniability essential to preventing open confrontation. In the end, the investigation stalled publicly while accelerating privately. Maktoom's death faded from headlines, but not from memory. Its legacy lingered in strained relations, revised protocols, and an unspoken acknowledgement that rules had been enforced again. Behind every operation lies an architecture invisible to the public, composed of memos, approvals, and denials. These bureaucracies function like shadow empires, where accountability dissolves across committees and responsibility becomes a concept endlessly deferred upward. Within these structures, violence is translated into policy language. Assassination becomes neutralization. Death becomes outcome assessment. Moral weight is diluted through process, allowing individuals to act decisively while believing consequences belong to institutions rather than hands. History shows these systems outlast governments. Leaders rotate, ideologies shift, yet the machinery persists, adapting quietly. Files are archived, reopened, and reinterpreted, giving the illusion of control while ensuring continuity of clandestine authority. For operatives, the bureaucracy provides insulation. Orders arrive fragmented, never complete. Each participant sees only a segment, preventing full comprehension. This fragmentation is not flaw but design, protecting the whole by limiting individual awareness. Maktoom's death passed through such channels. No single signature authorized it. Instead, a convergence of assessments, silences, and procedural inertia produced inevitability without explicit command, a decision made everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Within the shadows operate elite units trained to erase themselves. Their identities dissolve into archetypes: the watcher, the courier, the cleaner, each defined by function rather than name, existing briefly before returning to obscurity. They train endlessly for moments measured in minutes. Precision replaces emotion. Success is defined by absence, by nothing happening afterward. Their reward is invisibility, their failure exposure, their legacy silence. These operatives inherit myths rather than medals. Stories circulate internally, stripped of detail, reinforcing culture without evidence. Each mission becomes a parable, teaching restraint, patience, and the cost of error without revealing truth. They do not seek recognition. Recognition is danger. Their value lies in blending so completely that even history struggles to prove they existed beyond rumor and redacted footnotes. Years earlier, a scientist collapsed in a European hotel room under similar circumstances. Authorities ruled heart failure. Files later suggested foreign involvement, but evidence evaporated, leaving only patterns noted quietly by analysts. In another case, a financier disappeared after boarding a ferry. His belongings were found neatly arranged. No witnesses emerged. Intelligence communities recognized the signature but never acknowledged it publicly. These operations echoed across decades, each distinct yet familiar. Different cities, different targets, same restraint. Violence engineered to resemble fate, creating unresolved endings that denied closure and discouraged pursuit. Such echoes formed institutional memory. They shaped doctrine, refined methods, and reinforced belief that subtlety outperformed spectacle. Maktoom's death joined this lineage, another scene added to an unspoken archive. Above it all sit decision-makers, flawed and human, yet insulated by distance. They weigh lives against stability, risks against headlines, convinced restraint justifies action taken in silence. They pull strings indirectly, rarely seeing consequences firsthand. When outcomes stabilize, they claim prudence. When fallout erupts, they deny authorship. Power, in this realm, is exercised most effectively when it remains unseen. Nasir Maktoom was buried quietly on the outskirts of Beirut. His funeral carefully calibrated to project dignity without provocation. Senior figures attended discreetly, avoiding speeches that might invite escalation or confirm suspicions already circulating beyond Lebanon's borders. Mourners framed his death as natural, emphasizing patience and endurance rather than retaliation. Within Hezbollah, directives stressed continuity, signaling that operations would proceed uninterrupted despite the sudden absence of a critical administrator. Privately, however, confusion spread. Supply chains stalled temporarily. Decisions slowed. Trusted intermediaries sought clarification that never came. The gap Maktoom left behind was not symbolic. It was operational, immediate, and deeply unsettling. Internationally, reactions remained restrained. No government issued direct accusations. Silence dominated official channels, reinforcing the unspoken agreement that acknowledgement itself would constitute escalation neither side desired publicly. Long-term consequences. Over time, Maktoom's responsibilities were divided among several successors. This decentralization reduced efficiency and increased exposure. Redundancy replaced elegance. Security protocols tightened, but flexibility diminished, altering the organization's operational rhythm permanently. Adversaries adjusted as well. Intelligence services analyzed post-Maktoom patterns, exploiting inefficiencies created by his absence. Interdictions increased modestly, delays compounded. The system functioned, but with visible strain. Regionally, the assassination reinforced reliance on covert action as a preferred instrument of state power. It validated targeted killing as effective disruption without open war, further entrenching clandestine conflict as the dominant mode of engagement. For Beirut, the episode deepened its reputation as contested ground. Hotels, airports, and public spaces were reimagined as arenas where invisible battles unfolded, eroding any remaining illusion of neutrality or sanctuary. Within intelligence communities, Maktoum's case became instructional. Training scenarios referenced it obliquely. Analysts debated thresholds. Planners cited it as evidence that patience, not force, produced decisive outcomes under modern geopolitical constraints. In the end, Nasir Maktoum's death changed little in the grand scheme of geopolitics. Conflicts endured. Alliances held. Yet what it revealed was a hidden world, one where governments sanction killers, where bureaucracy replaces conscience, and where the truth remains buried in the shadows.